Pastor Malcolm Reeves stood before his congregation as a symbol of purity, while Helena Reeves carried a secret so powerful that once revealed, it turned their perfect family into the scene of a nightmare no one saw coming. Pastor Malcolm Reeves lived a life wrapped in admiration and quiet authority. His presence commanded entire rooms without him raising his voice. In the small town where he preached, his name carried weight. It symbolized structure, guidance, and perfect discipline. To the public, he appeared to be the kind of man who never made mistakes, the kind of leader who always placed family and faith at the center of everything he did. But beneath the surface of his well-managed life, cracks had been slowly forming for years, cracks only visible inside the walls of the Reeves home. Helena Reeves was known as the elegant and soft-spoken wife who supported her husband in every part of his ministry. She attended church events, stood beside Malcolm during sermons, shook hands with visitors, and served meals at countless community gatherings. But people rarely noticed how tired her eyes looked beneath carefully applied makeup, or how her hands trembled slightly when no one was watching. Her life revolved around keeping Malcolm's reputation spotless, and she had grown used to burying her fears, her exhaustion, and her unhappiness deep beneath rehearsed smiles. Their daughter, Naomi, was the bright star of the family. At 12 years old, she carried the kind of innocence and warmth that made people adore her instantly. She was cheerful, sweet, and polite, and the congregation loved her as if she were their own. But as she grew older, subtle differences in her features began to attract attention. Some church members commented lightly that she had striking eyes or unusual curls, details that didn't quite resemble Malcolm. These remarks were harmless at first, but they planted seeds Malcolm could not stop from growing. Malcolm's obsession started slowly. He found himself staring at Naomi a little too long, studying her face, comparing her smile and her hair to his own features. Then he began collecting old family photos, squinting at them with growing frustration. Naomi looked even less like him in those early pictures. He tried to ignore the unease, but each passing day tightened something in his chest. His mind became a battlefield of suspicion, shame, and wounded pride. Over time, Malcolm's inner world transformed. He grew harsher at home, more demanding, more controlling. He watched Helena closely, reading into every movement and expression. He checked her phone when she showered, scanned her old travel receipts, even questioned her past in ways that felt more like interrogations than conversations. Helena sensed his rising tension but convinced herself that it was only stress from the church. She had no idea how deeply rooted his fear of humiliation had become or how twisted his thoughts were growing each day. Publicly, Malcolm maintained his gentle pastor image, offering comforting prayers and warm smiles. But privately, he felt his life slipping out of his control. The idea that Naomi might not be his daughter tormented him. It wasn't only the betrayal that frightened him. It was the imagined judgment of his congregation, the possibility that people would whisper about him behind closed doors, the fear of losing everything he had built on the foundation of being a morally strong, faithful husband. One evening, after yet another day of overthinking, Malcolm confronted Helena with the quiet intensity of someone who had already decided the truth for himself. He didn't shout. He didn't accuse loudly. He simply walked into their bedroom and stood there, as if waiting for confirmation of the nightmare he had constructed in his mind. Helena didn't know what pushed her to finally reveal her long-kept secret, but years of guilt carried her words out in a trembling confession that shattered both their lives at once. Helena's confession did not erupt from anger or desperation. It slipped out like a wound finally tearing open. For more than a decade, the truth had lived inside her like a constant ache. She had learned to function with it, to smile through it, to serve beside Malcolm while pretending nothing about her past threatened the image he valued more than anything. But when Malcolm stood in front of her that night, silent and unblinking, something in her finally gave way. She revealed the truth about the brief connection she once had with a Jamaican tourist named Dorian, a moment of weakness during a time when her marriage felt cold and suffocating. She explained that Naomi was the result of that encounter, and that she had kept the secret to protect the fragile stability of their home. For Helena, telling the truth was an act of emotional release. She believed that honesty would help them rebuild trust, that it might even open the door to healing. But Malcolm didn't hear her words with the heart of a husband. He processed them with the mind of a man whose identity was built entirely on the approval of others. As Helena spoke, Malcolm's expression remained frozen, his eyes dark and unreadable. He didn't ask questions. He didn't break down. He simply stared forward as if the world he had crafted so carefully was being dismantled piece by piece. Inside him, humiliation grew like a wildfire. The idea that his wife had been unfaithful was painful enough, but knowing that the daughter he cherished and presented proudly to the congregation was not biologically his ignited a rage that he didn't yet show on the surface. To Malcolm, the confession was not just a betrayal, it was an explosion that threatened his reputation, his status, and his carefully cultivated image of moral perfection. He imagined the whispers, the gossip, and the possible loss of his church, and the humiliation of being seen as a man who couldn't control his own household. His mind twisted everything Helena said into a personal attack. In the following days, Malcolm lived in a strange, controlled silence. He went through his routines at church with mechanical precision. He delivered sermons about forgiveness, grace, and inner peace while feeling none of those things himself. His calmness only intensified the storm brewing inside him. He replayed Helena's confession repeatedly, each time adding new layers of resentment, anger, and disgust. He convinced himself that her actions had ruined everything he had worked for. His obsession with maintaining dignity became an anchor dragging him deeper into paranoia. Helena noticed the change in him immediately. His movements were stiff, his tone clipped, his presence heavier than usual. She tried to draw him into conversation, but he responded with cold distance. She attempted to explain again, to express remorse, but Malcolm listened without truly hearing. She started to fear the silent version of him more than any angry outburst. She knew he was wounded, but she didn't understand how deeply or how dangerously. Meanwhile, Naomi remained blissfully unaware of the storm unfolding around her. She laughed, studied, and went about her days with the innocence of someone who had never imagined her existence could be the center of such darkness. Her presence, which once brought warmth to the family, now became a trigger for Malcolm's spiraling thoughts. Every smile, every movement, every tiny resemblance to someone other than him fueled his internal fury. Malcolm's mind began constructing a narrative where he was the victim of the ultimate betrayal. He transformed Helena's confession into proof that she had corrupted their home and brought shame into his life. He believed that removing the stain on his reputation was the only way to restore order. This belief grew stronger with each passing day, feeding on his silence and pride. Helena never imagined the depth of danger she had awakened, and Malcolm never showed a single outward sign of the violent resolution forming quietly within him. The night that would change everything began without warning. It was one of those quiet evenings when the air in the Reeves home felt strangely heavy, thick with unspoken tension that neither Helena nor Malcolm dared to acknowledge. Naomi had finished her homework, eaten dinner, and gone to bed without sensing the storm gathering just beyond her bedroom door. To her it was simply another peaceful night. But to Malcolm, it was the moment he had been building toward ever since Helena's confession shattered the structure of his carefully managed world. He moved through the house with a calmness that felt unnatural. Every step seemed calculated, every small action part of a larger plan that had been forming in the darker corners of his mind. He locked the front door quietly, sliding the bolt into place with deliberate precision. He checked the windows, closing the curtains, until they fully blocked any view from outside. The house, always filled with the soft glow of warm light, felt unusually dim as he unplugged the security cameras he had installed years earlier for protection, or as it now seemed, for convenience. Helena noticed his movements from the living room. She didn't understand why he was shutting the house down so early, but she had grown so used to his rigid behaviors that she didn't question it out loud. She watched him cross the room with a blank expression that worried her more than any argument ever had. Something about the slow, silent way he moved made her chest tighten. She considered approaching him, trying once more to create a bridge between them, but the coldness in his eyes kept her frozen in place. Malcolm's mind worked like a machine. He had convinced himself that order could only be restored by removing the source of chaos. Helena, in his mind, was the person who had dismantled his life, poisoned his reputation, and created a future of humiliation he could not bear. He believed that by eliminating her, He could erase the stain she brought into his home. His reasoning twisted itself into something horrific yet clear to him. He saw this night as a necessary correction, a final act of control, as he prepared for what he believed must be done. Helena finally sensed the depth of danger. A cold panic began to spread through her as she watched him handle objects in the kitchen that he had no reason to touch. There was something chilling in his stillness, something terrifying in the meticulous way he moved. Her instinct told her to run, but she convinced herself that she was imagining things, that Malcolm was still the man she had married, still the pastor who preached compassion and forgiveness. She hoped that approaching him gently might break whatever dark trance he was in. But the moment she tried to move toward him, Malcolm's posture changed. His body stiffened as if he had been waiting for that exact moment. The atmosphere inside the house shifted instantly, becoming suffocating and sharp. Helena felt a rising dread as she realized her confession had not cleansed their marriage. It had pushed Malcolm into a state of cold calculation she could not recognize. What happened next unfolded with a disturbing level of efficiency. Malcolm acted without hesitation, guided by a chilling combination of anger and rigid control. The man who once stood at the pulpit delivering messages of love and peace transformed into someone unrecognizable. The home that had once echoed with laughter, routine, and simple family moments became the backdrop of a nightmare. In Naomi's room, the soft sound of her steady breathing continued undisturbed. She had no idea that her mother's life was being stolen in the hallway just beyond her door. She slept peacefully as the darkest moment in her family's history unfolded. By the time the moon shifted higher in the sky and the house fell quiet again, Helena Reeves no longer existed within its walls. And Malcolm stood in the center of the silence he had created, convinced that this brutal act was the beginning of restoring his damaged pride. Morning sunlight filtered into the Reeves home, illuminating a scene that no one in the community could have imagined existed just hours earlier. Malcolm stood in the kitchen with the practiced expression of a man preparing to step into a role he had perfected over the years, the grieving, confused husband. He reheated a cup of coffee he had no intention of drinking and placed it on the counter, as if Helena had simply stepped out for a walk. Every movement he made was designed to leave behind a believable picture of normalcy. Once satisfied, he left the house and drove to the church as if it were any other Sunday morning, his mind already shaping the story he would tell. By mid-afternoon, panic began to ripple through the congregation as Malcolm informed several members that Helena had not returned home since the previous night. He spoke with a shaky voice, forcing tremors into his hands, portraying himself as a man barely holding himself together. The congregation responded instantly, forming search groups, printing flyers, and calling every hospital within an hour's drive. Members described Helena as dependable and loving, the kind of woman who would never disappear without a trace. Their concern grew quickly, and whispers of fear and speculation spread like smoke through the church hallways. Malcolm immersed himself in the chaos he created. He comforted anxious volunteers, handed out flyers with tremulous breaths, and prayed loudly with groups gathered outside the church. To the untrained eye, he appeared devastated. But underneath his carefully crafted performance, he studied everyone around him, ensuring he stayed one step ahead of suspicion. His controlled demeanor fooled nearly everyone, except for the few who began noticing subtle inconsistencies in his behavior. Naomi, still unaware of the full truth, told one of the church deacons something that planted the first seed of doubt. She mentioned hearing water running late at night and seeing her father carrying a heavy black trash bag toward the garage. She thought he was taking out garbage, but the deacon found the detail unsettling. He didn't want to alarm the child, yet he couldn't ignore the unease curling in his stomach. Meanwhile, neighbors began sharing strange observations. One reported hearing repeated thuds and scraping sounds coming from the Reeves home close to midnight. Another recalled seeing Malcolm's truck leaving the garage at an odd hour, its back covered with a tarp that had never been there before. None of these observations were enough to accuse him directly, but together they formed a pattern the police could not overlook. When detectives searched the house, they found faint traces of bleach near the hallway and in the bathroom drain. The air carried the sharp, sterile smell of recent cleaning. They also noticed that a large freezer Malcolm once kept in the garage was missing. He casually explained he had sold it, but could not produce the buyer's name, phone number, or any record of transaction. His controlled answers raised more questions than they resolved. Investigators expanded their search, combing through every part of town Malcolm had visited recently. They examined CCTV footage, tracked his cell phone movement, and followed a trail of small but troubling details. Their search eventually led them to a storage facility on the outskirts of the city, where a unit rented under Malcolm's name contained several industrial containers sealed tightly and labeled with cleaning products. What the officers found inside those containers shifted the case from a missing person search to a homicide investigation. The horrifying discovery revealed exactly what had happened to Helena, and the perfect image Malcolm presented to the world began to crumble with terrifying speed. The discovery inside the storage unit brought an immediate and chilling end to the search for Helena Reeves. Detectives who had opened the sealed containers recoiled at what they found, their training barely preparing them for the gruesome sight. The remains inside were unmistakably human, and later DNA confirmation proved they belonged to Helena. The cold, clinical way the body had been separated and stored told investigators everything they needed to know about the state of mind of the person responsible. It was not a crime committed in a moment of panic, but one carried out with disturbing precision and emotional detachment. News of the discovery spread quickly among law enforcement, and the quiet corridor of the storage facility soon transformed into a flurry of activity. Officers taped off the area, evidence specialists documented every inch of the unit, and detectives exchanged grim glances as the magnitude of the crime settled heavily around them. There was no doubt that the suspect would be Malcolm Reeves. Every clue, every inconsistency, and every piece of physical evidence pointed directly to him. Now, the challenge was not figuring out who committed the crime, but bringing him into custody before he realized how close they were. Malcolm was arrested the following morning at the church. He had been preparing for Sunday service, arranging hymn books, adjusting microphones, and standing before the pulpit as if nothing were wrong. When officers walked down the aisle toward him, his expression did not shift into shock or fear. Instead, he closed his eyes for a brief moment, as though acknowledging an inevitable conclusion he had already accepted. He offered no resistance as they handcuffed him. Church members watched in confusion and horror, unable to reconcile the image of their trusted spiritual leader with the charges being read aloud. After his arrest, Malcolm was interviewed at the police station. He maintained a chilling calmness, speaking in a controlled tone as if discussing a matter unrelated to human life. He insisted that everything he had done was necessary to restore order to his home and protect his reputation. He described Helena's confession as a catastrophic betrayal and framed his actions as a response to the destruction of his spiritual authority. There was no apology, no remorse, not even a moment of hesitation in his recounting of events. His emotional detachment stunned even the most experienced investigators. The trial that followed became one of the most talked about cases in the region. Media outlets covered it relentlessly, captivated by the shocking contrast between Malcolm's public persona and the brutality of his crime. Former church members filled the courtroom, struggling to understand how the man who had baptized their children and counseled their families could commit such an unthinkable act. Prosecutors presented overwhelming evidence: the storage unit records, the forensic findings, the bleach traces in the Reeves home, and the testimonies from neighbors and Naomi. The jury took little time to reach a verdict. Malcolm Reeves was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The courtroom remained silent as the judge read the decision. Some cried, others stared blankly ahead, unable to process how deeply they had been misled. Naomi, now living with extended family, learned the truth about her mother's fate and her own origins under the care of professionals trained to guide children through trauma. The innocence she once carried would never fully return, replaced by a heavy understanding of how secrets and pride had torn her family apart. The Reeves home was eventually abandoned, its windows dark and its walls stained with the memory of what had happened. The church struggled to rebuild its foundation, while the community grappled with the realization that evil can hide behind even the most polished faces. Malcolm's downfall became a grim reminder that some of the darkest acts are committed not by strangers lurking in the shadows, but by those who stand in plain sight, cloaked in trust and authority.